There are places on this planet that are beautiful beyond description. Places that are undeniably worth crossing the globe to experience firsthand, and which offer moments and memories as rich reward for those who do. But for a privileged few, the journey is even more valuable. For Australians, it is a journey to discover home, to explore an Australia you barely knew existed, and from there, take yourself to see it for real.
Hope you enjoyed the short video we had for you. The best place in the world is the words they use to describe it. But would Muslims say the same? Have you ever wondered what life is like for a Muslim in Australia? In a country or continent, whatever you choose to call it, so remote from the rest of the world. Does the stereotypical attitude towards Muslims reach this continent? Today we have a special episode focused on this part of the world. We have invited onto our hot seat two Australians, Zainab and Rima, to give us an insight on how Australia responds to Islam and more precisely, Muslims. We will primarily be looking at how culture, education, media and community life in Australia interacts with Islam in order to understand whether there exists any Islamophobic atmosphere or behaviour. Recently, a Dutch politician named Geert Wilders visited Australia to talk about immigration and Islam. He says that the religion is incompatible with freedom and claims that Muslims are damaging Western society. This is the advice he had to give to the Australian public.
I like to see myself as a messenger of hope. I have really nothing at all to do with hate. I spoke in Melbourne. There were more than 500 people there, and well, they are very enthusiastic. And what I'm trying to do while I visit Australia is tell them that if Australia also in the future wants to stay a free society, a liberal and free society, then they can learn lessons on the mistakes that we made in Europe with inviting so many people from Islamic countries to come to our country. I have nothing against the people, but I'm here to warn Australia about the real nature of Islam.
Such a video begs the question, does Australia take into consideration such anti-Islamic advice? Let's begin our interview and find out. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us what you're doing in Australia?
My name is Zainab and I'm a speech pathologist by profession, and I was born and raised in Australia and currently reside in Australia. Brilliant.
Tell us a bit about the Australian culture. What describes a typical Australian?
Well, there's really I suppose there's no identifying statement that describes what an Australian is. Australia is a very young country and it's a very multicultural country. So different people have different perspectives on what a typical Australian might be. However, the universal values that all Australian people have is that they're very kind-hearted, good-natured people who are known to be very easygoing.
Well, my name is Rima and I was born and raised in Australia. I was there until I was 22 years of age, and then I migrated to Tanzania, and I've been in Tanzania for 6 years now.
Most of your family is from Australia?
Yeah, most of them have also been born and raised in Australia. However, my parents' generation are from the Middle East.
Can you give us a brief on the Australian culture? What describes a typical Australian?
Australian culture is not specifically any one ethnic group. It's made up of a variety of ethnic groups because it is a young country, and free migration was opened in Australia in the 60s and 70s to increase the Australian population and boost the Australian economy. It largely started out obviously as a British colony, so the first Australians, so to speak, were British in their culture. However, in the 60s and 70s, migration from the Middle East and Europe increased. And you have a good mix of different cultural and ethnic groups in Australia. So, you know, I would say a majority of Muslims in Australia do come from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. However, you know, there are obviously other religious groups that come from different cultures and different countries abroad.
So if I were to ask an Australian today, who are you? Can you describe yourself? The answer they would give is, we don't really have an identity.
At this point in time, even in Australia on a political level, people are still trying to determine a statement that identifies Australian values and what are Australian values. They're very broad, but overall they're very good-natured. They're very different in terms of they're not racist, for example. That would be a label that you might have for certain cultures. Australian people are not known to be racist people, not modern-day Australians in this modern era. So there is a lot of, you know, a lot of Australians are known internationally to be very easygoing people when they work overseas as expats. We're known to be very adventurous people because we have multiculturalism, we have a variety of different cultures. I think we're very, a lot more open-minded and open to new experiences.
You mentioned Australia is very multicultural. Around 23.6% of the population is foreign population. That means roughly 3/4 is native Australian Indigenous people. Are these people also open-minded as you describe? Do they also present a really multicultural attitude in Australia?
I think the statistics you're quoting are, when somebody looks at them at face value, it can be quite misleading. Because we need to understand that Australia is probably 220 odd years old in terms of its, if you want to look at it from the time of British colonisation. Prior to that, the indigenous population are the Aboriginals, and they're a minority. Even the Anglo-Saxon Australian is considered to be a migrant to this country. So similarly, I myself am born in Australia, so I'm considered to be an Australian, although I'm of Lebanese origin. So those statistics don't take into account the backgrounds, the multicultural backgrounds of all the cultures that reside in Australia. You have 6 or 7 generation Italian, Greek, Maltese, Chinese, Vietnamese, for example, and there's many, many other cultures. But we're talking about generations of families that where the children are born in Australia, so those statistics then make up that 3/4 that you're quoting. However, they do come from diverse backgrounds and are still practicing the culture of those backgrounds, sometimes the religion of those backgrounds, you know, the food practices. So it's very, very multicultural.
So still relatively diverse.
It's quite relatively diverse, that's correct. And that's in all major capital cities across Australia.
Okay. To what extent are Australians tolerant towards these different cultures that you mentioned and different nationalities?
The tolerance is very, very high. I think and in any organised community, where the tolerance is, I suppose, tested is when people go against order. And that's when, unfortunately, there are many cultures, be it due to ignorance, be it due to outright disrespect for laws, rules and regulations, go against order, and therefore they stand out. And that's when people are not tolerant. Because if everybody follows the order, then it's quite harmonious and it's quite easy to live together, to coexist in harmony, where everybody is free to hold their own religious or cultural practices, yet coexist beautifully as a society. So the intolerance comes about when there is chaos or disorder. So for example, if people from any background, you know, rape or rob a bank or you know, murder, that's not tolerated on any level, regardless of the culture that you're from.
You mentioned ignorance and that there exists a level of ignorance in Australia. Can you shed some light on, is there a fear of ignorance in Australia or fear of the unknown?
There isn't when we talk about ignorance, I was speaking about ignorance on behalf of the migrant coming to the country. So sometimes they don't know that they can't drive on the other side of the road or park on a footpath and disrupt the way of pedestrians, for example. So it's the ignorance on part of possibly the migrant or the newcomer to the country that leads to frustration and at times, you know, intolerance from the Australian community. And it's not necessarily the white Anglo-Saxon Australian that gets frustrated. Similarly, I, who am from a migrant background, would be equally frustrated if somebody was to do that.
Roughly, how much of the Australian population would consider themselves Australian as identity? Do people consider them as straight Australian?
I can't give you a percentage, but I can speak for myself. Being born and bred and raised in Australia, I consider myself to be an Australian. I could never go back to Lebanon and live there. I wouldn't be accepted by the community there, and I myself would not feel comfortable. Australia is my home. So the majority of people who are born and raised in Australia consider themselves Australian. I can speak on behalf of my parents who have been residing in Australia for nearly 40 years now. Although they're from a Lebanese background and they have a strong affiliation with their homeland, they too consider themselves Australian and adhere to the Australian values and expectations of the society and community with which they're living.
So you, according to you, would this various origins that people come from be the reason to them being open-minded to each other?
I think it's all about timing. So to give you an example, when I was a young girl, being from the Lebanese background, that community was very young at that time, and they were constantly either mocked at or targeted in the media for being people who possibly were, involved in either maybe, alleged, criminal activity, or who were just people who didn't follow rules or who had, didn't adhere to cultural values. And that's because they were a young community who needed time to adapt and assimilate into the community. Similarly now, 30 years on or 35 years on, I can now see the same thing happening to the Afghan and the Iraqi communities in Australia, because they are a very young community in Australia, and they are in a process of change between their old world, which is their homeland, and the new world. And they're slowly learning to understand that things that I did back home, I can't do here. It doesn't work. That system does not work here. So, because of their ignorance or their lack of education or their lack of understanding of the new place that they're coming to, they are looked upon in possibly a negative way, because people don't understand also the perspective that they're coming from.
You've highlighted timing, and that basically is the difference between Australia and other countries or continents. No, let's look at countries here, like UK or US. UK, US, other Western countries, they all have similar, regulations as Australia. You can't, it's not socially acceptable to start spitting on people over there either, and there are fines, and you can get imprisonment for certain actions. So, according to you, this timing factor is the main difference that causes people to be a lot more tolerant, open-minded in Australia?
No, the timing factor is the reason why the migrants have challenges in assimilating. The reason why people in Australia, I suppose, I feel, I've travelled to all the English-speaking countries internationally, and the biggest difference between an Australian and American is that an Australian generally is more easygoing and open-minded and more tolerant. They're not set in their ways. They don't have a particular ideology that they adhere to and insist on sticking to it. Now, some of them do, but the majority of them, if I was to have a conversation with them about my beliefs, or even about, this particular person doesn't understand what they're doing because of, A, B, C reason, that typical Australian person might say, oh, okay, and they would then understand with compassion, because they're very compassionate and understanding people, and they really do embrace, they're very worldly people, they embrace, different values and different ways of life and multiculturalism in general.
You mentioned education. A lot of people with high level of education come to Australia. Can you give us some background on the overall level of education in Australia?
Education in Australia is compulsory. It is also government funded largely. There are options of private and selective schools, however, parents do need to pay for that privately. So on average, most Australians have access to adequate levels of education in comparison to local levels of education. Having a teaching degree, I would definitely say that it is much higher than the standard level of public education which is available here in Tanzania. So, you know, on majority, most migrants and also those who are Australian citizens, so for example, first generation migrants who have now had children in Australia, will have access to free public education. By free, what I mean is that obviously there are a minimal level of fees and contributions that are, you know, compulsory to the school. However, a majority of the school year fees are subsidised or actually paid by the government. The government, through the Board of Studies, which is an organisation there structured by public government and the education sector, they have a compulsory attendance scheme for students. So they actually monitor students' attendance. It's a highly regulated society. So if your child is born and enrolled in the birth register, then they will obviously track that enrolment and make sure that that child goes to school through the various government programs and initiatives that they have. Basically, what they're aiming to do through that is to make the economy and the people of the population less dependent on the government. So in old age, the government is actually paying less to the ageing population, and they're more self-sufficient European countries.
Brilliant. They say over around 2/3 of the 15 to 64-year-olds in Australia have a qualification. Does this level of education affect their perception when it comes to taking in media? How they look at information presented to them? Mm-hmm. Are they ignorant to the fact that the media could be biased, or are they open-ended and, you know, taking different views of media?
Look, I definitely think on a general level we can assume that anybody who is educated will have better ability and a higher level of skill and aptitude in order to be able to absorb any kind of media that they're faced with. How they assess, interpret and then act on that information will depend on a variety of things, not only their education but perhaps their cultural background as well as their religious inclination, because different ethnic groups and different religious groups will promote different things within their community. So I think it's a variety of things which will affect how people or a general population will absorb and act on the media that they're exposed to. But definitely I think we can conclude that education in general will give people a stronger platform on which they can better interpret that media. I think also Australia being geographically isolated from the rest of the world, it does encourage a lot of Australians to travel to find out what's out there, and I think average income Australians can afford to do so. So I also think that that travel and exposure to other media globally and other environments culturally does open to a certain extent their mind and make them more susceptible to positive media rather than negative. But to comment on media in general in Australia, of course it is monitored, it is it is censored to a certain extent when it comes to written media in particular. But I think with the doors of social media at the moment, perhaps these real stories or the true stories kind of become more exposed because the younger generation is a lot more tech savvy, a lot more exposed through the internet in general and what kind of resources they can use online. So I think it's a balance of play. It would probably be the same in most, European or the Americas.
The combined gross enrollment ratio in education is 100% for females in Australia and about 97.5% for males. Would you see education as a heavy positive influence on this multicultural attitude in Australia? Does it play a role?
Most definitely, and it's from the top down, so it's from a government level. So if you look at the education sector, in as early as what we call kindergarten, which is the first year of schooling, we celebrate, we have a number of celebration days like Harmony Day. Children are encouraged to share their backgrounds, their values, bring different foods to school. There's a very, very strong anti-bullying campaign across the country that is administered in schools on a social level. So even if somebody was to bring some sort of racist ideology from home, that would be considered bullying and would be dealt with
at a young age.
At a very, very young age. So there's a lot of harmony and tolerance also we need to remember in the classrooms, children, there is not one particular race in the classroom.
So education in terms of playing roles, particularly at the perception of Muslims, you said that it helps, you know, the system over there helps raise awareness of different Islamic values that we Muslims have. What about the perception? Because sometimes we know the value of a person, but we still have a fear instilled in us. Does this system over there, we're talking about education here, present a positive image of Muslims in terms of education?
I don't think it presents any image of Muslims. Unfortunately, the education system is not looking at that. Perhaps in the higher grades, and we're looking at what we call year 11 and 12, which is those final years before university, there is, and in some religious-based schools like Catholic schools, they may address as a subject Islam in terms of comparative religion, so they'll look at different religions. And the way that Islam is presented might vary to what you and I perceive it to be, because it's obviously from Western perspective, Western ideology and Western history. So in that respect, there's not much opportunity there. Whether it's positive or negative is really relative. It's based on the person the perspective of the person receiving that information. But Islam is not really addressed as a positive or negative thing in education at all. It's we as Muslims and how we present ourselves that really changes or offers the perception. So if we as Muslims, and particularly sisters who wear hijab because we are an open symbol of Islam, if we cut in front of someone in traffic and when they get upset we just have give a rude gesture to that person, then that's the negative image we are giving of Islam, whether it be in school, in the school car park, or in society. Similarly, our behaviour is kind, friendly, and positive, then we are going to give that positive image within our environment in the education sector. But in terms of on an education level, the only address to Islam would be in the classroom where a child says, "I'm a Muslim, this is what I believe in." Similarly, a Chinese person might get up and say, "I'm a Taoist and this is what I believe in." So it's a sharing of information, but it's not promoted or addressed in an educational setting through the educational curriculum or syllabus.
Zainab, you studied in a university in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do?
You mean what did I study?
Yeah.
Okay, I studied speech pathology, which is a Bachelor of Applied Science.
Okay, and how is that experience in university when people are at the very mature age and are relatively well aware of cultures around? As a Muslim, how is it going through university? Did you face any challenges?
I did face challenges, but not necessarily from...
Nothing as a result of your faith?
No, not from the wider secular community, but more from within the Muslim community. So there's a lot of debate about different ideology and different persuasions, and that at times became a little bit uncomfortable. So the issue wasn't, I had no issues, let's say, with my lecturers or the institution or other classmates. It was more, in cafeteria break times with other Muslim brothers and sisters who obviously we draw together because,
mutual.
Birds of the same feather flock together. However, at the same time, once discussions about different ideology or different times of the year came up, there would be quite heated and passionate conversations that would take place that were at times uncomfortable and challenging. So they were the types of challenges I experienced. At the time that I was studying, which is quite a long time ago now, there was a sort of maybe a very small percentage of Muslims studying in universities across Australia, and they weren't very organised. Moving on, say 15 years or 18 years later now, there's a high percentage of Muslims studying in universities. They are a lot more organised. They have organised groups like social groups where they organise activities, whether it be religious activities or social activities, and we have Muslim lecturers, which are very known to be Muslim and known in their persuasion and accepted in that way, and even Muslims in high-end positions in institutions at the organisational level. So that's progressed quite consistently and rapidly over the past decade or so.
How has the media influenced general public in Australia? There is a high level of education. Does this stop people from taking media at first hand?
No, it doesn't, because, for example, if I heard something terrible about Sikhs on the news, I would probably just take what I heard from the news, and I wouldn't really go to the effort to research anything further about Sikhs and whether the information is correct or incorrect, or whether I needed to know more. I mean, that's just me personally. Maybe some people would make that effort. Similarly, if the wider community who is non-Muslim hears information about Muslims on the news, they are going to take it at face value. They are not going to really go any further and investigate it further unless they have a strong interest or a passion in that area. And through that journey, some of them are further indoctrinated by Western media because that's where the sites they're going to and the access they're having. And others along the way find out, they realise that, okay, things may not be what they seem. There's another side to this coin. So unfortunately in Australia, all of the media is controlled, is American influenced and controlled by the West. And that's the only perspective that Australians receive. And at times of high tension, like 9/11 or Bali bombings, yes, it can be quite difficult at times because that is the only information that is being fed.
So what is the general perception, according to you, someone who's lived in Australia for 21 years, of Muslims? Are Muslims seen as a group of people who bring positive benefits to society, or are they portrayed with those negative qualities that the few extremists unfortunately present them as?
I think most definitely Australians have suffered a little bit due to the global media and obviously the exacerbation of extremism and Islamophobia in the media. I can't say that we were immune, so to speak, from the effects of that. I definitely think Australians in general, regardless of their ethnic and religious background, are making positive contributions to the society. One thing I think I should specify is having lived in Australia, for example, as an international student, is quite different to having been born and raised in Australia as what you would classify yourself, so to speak, Australian. I think media is very effective in associating a physical, appearance with Islam and extremism, like, the beard, the kanzo, like you said, that kind of desert, dirty Arab look, that very unfinished, very, just unclean extremist. And normally they're carrying weapons, or their women have their face concealed, or they're wearing some kind of headscarf. So there is definitely an association, absolutely. I can't say that Australians are immune from that. It has had an effect, but I'm not saying that Australians are cruel or what could I say, or kind of vulgar in their response to that. I think once you do communicate with an Australian, they tend to kind of take you for who you are more so than what you look like.
Okay, so on the ground, do you ever experience any Islamophobic attacks? There must be some sort of result of all this media influence on face-to-face between people.
I can only speak for myself, and I reside in Sydney, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and I've never experienced an Islamic-phobic attack. And I don't really think Islamophobia exists. I don't think there is a phobia of Muslims. Sometimes there is a fear of the unknown, or a little bit of a resistance, like, oh, I don't know what's under that burqa. But it's not necessarily a phobia or a fear. Some people may experience challenges and difficulties based on where they are. So, some people who might work in rural Australia might have greater challenges, or some people who work in areas that are less populated by Muslims, such as the Northern Territory, might have some challenges, but I can't really tell you what they might be because I haven't heard of them.
Okay, let's shift our attention towards the riots in 2012 in Sydney. Mm-hmm. After the movie on the Prophet was made, yes, riots erupted all over the world, including Australia, Sydney, particularly, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And many complaints were put in that Muslims were acting in a very violent manner. Some say extremists were involved, and basically the image of Muslims when I watched the videos, which we'll show in a minute, was completely destroyed in my opinion, because we had people fighting with the police and so on. Can you tell us the effect this had in Australia from your experience?
Look, to be honest with you, like anything that causes a little bit of sensation, and you know, protests can always be done in a peaceful and diplomatic way. And I think there are a lot of young, fiery people in Australia who did really get offended, whose community groups also encouraged them to go out and protest. However, I did not see any official or any you know, centre or mosque, for example, encouraging Australians to go out and protest violently. So, you know, we can always put the blame, so to speak, on the protesters themselves. Normally there are a couple of troublemakers, as per is usual, as we saw in the UK and Canada as well, where people do start to, you know, kind of stir a little bit of trouble and cause damage to the public property, for example, we saw in some of these videos as well. But overall, I think it is disappointing for most Australian Muslims because, you know, they have enough against them. For example, on a global scale, you know, people have a negative perception of Islam, and there are a lot of groups that are trying to do a lot of interfaith dialogue and improve that image of Islam, specifically in Australia on a local level. So I think a lot of people were very disappointed at how easily that reputation can then be re-tarnished, and takes a lot of, you know, effort and kind of relationship building to fix. I most definitely think that doesn't speak on behalf of all of Australians, and I definitely think that it was a negative image to present to the media in general, and I definitely think the media also probably exaggerated to a certain extent, because that's the agenda on a local.
So there's this multicultural atmosphere.
Definitely.
So is there any way that Muslims, say after the Prophet's movie was taken out, is there any way Muslims can take advantage of this multicultural atmosphere that is a lot more present in Australia relative to other Western countries when it comes to countering such offensive movies?
Yes, of course, and definitely there are educated and more, I would say, civil ways of going about it on an intellectual and an academic level. And you do find that there are student groups which are specifically active in universities who organise seminars with interfaith dialogue, so calling people from different faiths and talking about, you know, desecrating any holy, sanctified or religious book or personality. And that did happen in Australia. There were a couple of venues that were involved, a couple of tertiary institutions who were supporting, funding and promoting, you know, values, basically human values, to appreciate these.
So rather than targeting at Islam, you know, making it all about Muslims, they kind of targeted the whole global scale.
Yeah, local, I would say, like domestic scale religious groups and religious figures.
A former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, said in an interview that there is never any excuse for violent behaviour. So anybody who wants to replicate that behaviour today, I just want to say very strongly that this kind of conduct has no place in the streets of our country. These are quite a few strong words from the Prime Minister. Wouldn't you say this brings about a fear of Muslims, because suddenly all Muslims are being targeted by his words?
It didn't bring out a fear of Muslims, it was a disgust in Muslims. And I can say, as a Muslim myself, I was disgusted when I saw that on television. And she represents exactly how I feel and how the majority of the Muslim population felt. And if we were to look further into the statements made by almost every community centre and mosque across Sydney and Australia, they all supported her views, because we as Australian Muslims also want to live in a peaceful society, and the behaviour of that select group of individuals was, unfortunately, it's not acceptable. It's un-Islamic. Our imams did not behave in that way. Our Prophet, peace be upon him, did not behave in that way. They are representing a small group of people who have a very select ideology, and unfortunately they are such a minority. But again, as the media chooses to take things to play the tune of whatever it is seeking, they then end up representing the majority, which is, across the world internationally, is very disheartening for all Muslims, because people like those youths that we saw in that at that time of the year, or even people like what we see on TV, like Osama bin Laden or what's happening in Syria, they don't represent Islam, the teachings of Islam, or
So
even the majority of Muslims practicing Islam. So it is very disheartening, and ideally people like that don't belong anywhere. And I think anywhere in the world it's not tolerated or accepted as socially acceptable behaviour.
So is the Australian government able to separate between extremist Muslims and Muslims?
The government itself is. So there are very strong government bodies, for example the Australian Federal Police, who know the difference between everyday Muslims and the extremist Muslims, and the police let's say at a judicial level work very strongly with all community leaders and always know what's happening in every centre, in every home. You know, they use their intelligence in a positive way to assist the Muslim community and also to extract information from them if they need to.
Don't you think it's ironic that the owner of, 96% of the media in the world today is Jewish Australian? So someone whose identity, from what we've discussed, is supposed to present a very harmonious, multicultural attitude towards all cultures, is actually the source, or if you want to call it, of all this negative media that portrays Islam in the wrong way. Don't you think what do you have to say about this?
Well, I don't think it's ironic, I just think it's unfortunate. Unfortunately, he, although, I mean, he's a Jewish and he's Australian, they're both great things to be, but maybe he in his personality or in his political persuasion is something else. It's like, I'm an Australian Muslim, but if I go out and murder somebody, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm portraying what an Australian is or what a Muslim is. That's possibly some sort of sickness within myself. Now, unfortunately, you know, this person is, you know, is driven by a higher, possibly material agenda, be it political, be it monetary, whatever it is that, you know, allows him to control things in that way. But at the same time, if we go back to some of the things we've mentioned previously, although all of this media is coming through as information, people are not really acting upon it. They're just taking it, but they're not really doing much with it.
Can you shed some light on Muslim politics? How does that, is there a lot of participation by Muslims in politics?
We do have politicians in, it's only recently that we've had people who actually practicing Muslims who are beginning to acquire positions at government, high-end government levels, or, you know, like a mayor of a particular town, for example. So that's been positive progress, and it's only just the beginning. So as we move forward, we'll see a lot more of that. Muslims in general, I think, because of the different cultural backgrounds they come from, are very political. You know, be it they're Pakistani or they're Arab or they're Asian. So unfortunately, they bring a lot of their politics from home into the country. So whilst Muslims living in Australia don't have issues with the secular population, they do have a lot of issues amongst one another, be it, you know, sectarian or different ideology or, pardon me, different schools of thought. So if I refer back to when I was at university, a long time ago, you know, people debating the most minuscule thing, and they get quite aggressive about it to the point where it can become, you know, quite tense. Similarly, even now you have different centres or different communities bickering amongst one another over an ideology, in particular with the escalation of the Syrian crisis. You know, everyone's bringing politics from outside into the country.
The last thing I want to cover in terms of media is the Bali bombing. How did Australians react to this? It was in 2002, quite a long time ago, a decade. What was the general reaction from the public, and did you face any difficulties during that time?
Well, obviously it was quite disappointing and shocking for everyone at the time, regardless of what your faith was. Because, you know, as Australians, it's always tragic to see something terrible happen to other people. And for it to happen to Australian people, yes, the people who were affected were outraged. And when people feel threatened, You know, they behave in different ways. So there was a little bit of tension for a couple of weeks in that people were really, really angry at the fact that they felt violated, and they felt that perhaps they were being attacked as a culture. And
Muslims?
Well, they felt violated by Muslims because the media portrayed it as a Muslim attack by Muslims for a religious cause. So it wasn't by Indonesians, it wasn't a cultural thing. So it became an international issue. And don't forget, that was riding on the back of 9/11 as well. So there was already that media hype continuing on. But it very quickly disseminated, and this is where the government is very good at putting out fires. So they might allow little fires to start, but they also put them out very, very quickly. It didn't really affect, I mean, the Muslim community felt a bit tense because we felt like we were being blamed for something that we didn't do. But at the same time, we understood why people felt that way. And, you know, with time, as always, things slowly die down and become normal again. But it was a very, very tragic incident, which, you know, should never have happened. And if we look at it, again, if we look at Islam in its purest form, there is no Islamic reason or should be, I mean, you can't really associate Islam with the action that happened.
Definitely. What are some of the main challenges Muslim communities face in Australia? You've kind of briefed on one, touched on the surface, which is that they don't seem to be getting involved into programs that could really benefit our society, our whole image over there at least. Can you elaborate on other challenges?
I think one of the major challenges more recently, and I mean in the last 10 years, has definitely been the stereotypes associated with Muslims. Muslims are, in Australia, particularly from the work that I did when I was there, when I was still living there, and I do obviously have contact with the community when I go back on a frequent basis, is that they feel like they're on the defensive foot, okay, because people have certain stereotypes, and you know, and it's not necessarily because we're treated that way, but it's because of an insecurity, because of feeling like the other, because of what we see and you know, how you think the world perceives you. So this interfaith dialogue, and there have been a few sheikhs in Australia, in the local community, who have been pushing interfaith dialogue so that people and the Muslim community in general feel more confident interacting with other religious groups. You know, on a social level and professional level, I think it's two different perspectives. Australia's professional environment is incredibly respectful because we have a lot of laws that protect discrimination on specific cultures because of its multiculturalism. For example, praying, taking religious holidays, you know, food, availability of food, things like that are highly regulated when it comes to employment and human relations law. So on a professional level, you don't face as many challenges as you would on a social level, because a social level is obviously more free. You could meet people anywhere, on the train, you know, in the shopping mall, you know, outside your front door, for example, on the pathway. So those kind of social experiences are a little more open than what you would have in a professional environment, because everybody is kind of adhering to a specific code when they're at work. It's different. You're a colleague, you're not a friend, for example.
Regulations involved.
Yeah, exactly. But in regards to the social sense, the community, what is definitely affecting the community is, I think, what I see, you know, I think naturally human beings tend to stick together. And albeit that we're quite social as a cultural group, as an ethnic group, I speak specifically on behalf of Lebanese, but don't forget, Muslims are from a variety of cultural and ethnic groups in Australia, you know, Iranian, Afghani, Indonesian, Chinese, we have European Muslims, British and American Muslims. So depending on culture, I think it largely affects how people interact with a wider society. Lebanese, if I can speak from that specific perspective, because that's my experience, we're more open, quite social in terms of our culture, quite inviting and hospitable in general. So we tend to interact more freely with, you know, Australians and other ethnic groups in general. So that obviously has a positive effect on what people perceive you to be and how you perceive others to be, because obviously through personal interaction, those guards do come down, like we spoke about earlier.
So we come down to perception and participation. Quite an interesting combination. How would you suggest to tackle these two issues in Australia, perhaps for students coming into Australia or for people already there?
Well, I think it's excellent the way you put it, perception and participation. I think they're both largely dependent on Muslims, activism or participation and presence in society. Well, how are we contributing to the wider society? I mean, that's an Islamic code and system. In our religion, we're encouraged to better the society. It's a part of the way we should be living. The social system that we live in. No, I'm not saying go out there and make it an Islamic society, because it is a Western government. However, to whatever ability we can, and making sure Muslim issues are addressed, for example, in government. Women's right to wear hijab is never impeded like it has been in other European countries. But people's right to pray, people's right to be treated like equal citizens, regardless of what their outward appearances. For example, if they choose to wear hijab, or if they choose to participate in convent, whatever religion, really, it's a human value, the freedom and right to choose and practice. So I think Muslims need to be, definitely, wherever we are in the world, I mean, I feel like wherever you are, as a student, as a citizen, as a parent, as a participant of the society, you should be encouraging these things in your local community and on a global scale. Because, like, for example, in our situation here in Tanzania, we have a lot of Muslim students who need to go abroad to study for tertiary education, because, for example, local universities aren't as well renowned or well recognized as others. So we need to think as well, like, we Muslims are migrating all over the world and participating in a variety of societies and communities. We need to let people know that our religion is a peaceful one, it's a positive one, and our children and our future generations are going to be highly exposed to these different places in the world. So wherever we are, we need to focus and be participative in that society. Even here in Tanzania, there's quite a lax of participation with local Africans. I mean, we tend to kind of stick to each other, to our own ethnic group, be it Indian, be it Arab, be it, specifically Shia or Sunni, for example, and it shouldn't be the case. The case should be that we should participate more in the overall society that we live in.
After the Woolwich event in the UK, there was strong pressure from the media in terms of portraying Islam as the religion at fault and the one responsible for for the extremist acts we saw. And suddenly you feel this sense of vulnerability in the UK, and everyone's attention kind of turns to the media and starts listening into what they have to say, which is all like fine, it's correct on the facts, but the wrong portrayal of Islam is given. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's a strong, pressure coming from media in the UK. Does this exist in Australia as well? I mean, do you have this same level of pressure coming from media?
I think most definitely, yes. Look, I think the events are very different. If something like that does happen, the media will take complete control and present that the way that they see fit to suit the specific agenda or the marketing budget even of that particular station. In Australia, we had similar circumstances where there were rape issues. This is post 9/11 and prior to 2012, where the people who committed the crimes were portrayed as of Arab descent. Their religion was not specified, however, it was largely assumed of Arab descent associated directly with Islam. And there was a bit of a, kind of hype about Islam being a barbaric religion where women are oppressed and abused, for example, because this was specifically a rape case. So the young man was given life in prison, and that was a precedent in Australia. It had never happened for a rape case before, and he was under 21 years of age. So in that regard, definitely media can influence, and in that specific situation, I definitely think media exposure affected the case and the ruling in a sense, specifically on that case, because like I said, it was a precedent. It's never happened in Australian law before. 9/11 would have had to be the catalyst, I think. I think that was the one that really did affect society and the way people perceived Islam. I think because it was the most shocking event that's happened in recent history of the world. After that kind of peak I would say, yes, there was discrimination. I was discriminated against personally. because people had a negative perception of Islam and Muslims, and we were terrorists, for example. You know, there was that whole Muslims are terrorists. It was just a huge thing at that time. After that died down a little bit, I think people started to have a greater appreciation because of Muslim activism against that bad media. So that died down a little bit, and I think most people learned the lesson to then assess. Then came the issue of weapons of mass destruction, and that was disproved. So the war in Iraq, and there were Australian soldiers involved in that. And, you know, people having been touched by loss of life of a family member for a reason which turned out to be falsified and, you know, in the interest of specific governments, did change people's perspectives. So we had returned servicemen, so returned soldiers coming back to Australia, basically saying, well, we went in there, we did a lot of damage, we killed innocent people, but for what gain? We end up finding out officially that there are no weapons of mass destruction, and that Saddam was not even a threat to the world, so to speak, as was exacerbated. So people lost a lot of faith in the government and lost trust in the messages that they were getting from both the UK specifically, USA, and the Australian government's involvement in these wars overseas. The wonderful thing about Australia's geographic location is that people tend to think, well, it's none of our business. You know, why should we send our people and spend funding, you know, Australian government's foreign money is going towards these foreign wars when we've got our own issues in Australia, when we should be spending the money on education, on healthcare.
That's all the questions we have for you today. Thank you so much for coming on to our show and giving us so much on Australia.
Thanks for having me.
And have a safe journey back.
Thank you very much.